What if your ability to express your truth without controlling the outcome is the very force that creates real magnetism? There is a moment in every meaningful interaction where a quiet decision is made. Do you speak honestly or do you adjust? Do you reveal what you truly feel or do you filter it to maintain a certain response? And beneath that decision, there is often an invisible expectation. If I say this, they should respond this way. This is where most expressions lose their power. Not because they are untrue, but because they are attached. Attached to approval, to validation, to a specific reaction that confirms you are safe, accepted, understood. And when that attachment is present, your energy shifts. Your words may be clear, but your intention becomes conditional. You are no longer expressing, you are negotiating. And people feel that, not always consciously, but energetically. There is a subtle pressure in the interaction, a sense that something is being asked for in return. And that pressure weakens the very thing you are trying to create. Because magnetism is not built on control. It is built on freedom. The freedom to express without needing to manage how it lands. The freedom to be clear without needing to be agreed with. The freedom to show up without needing to be chosen. And when that freedom becomes internal, something changes in the field between you and others. Your presence becomes lighter, but stronger. Your words become simpler, but more impactful. Your energy stops reaching and starts standing. And paradoxically, this is what draws people in. Because there is no longer a demand in your expression, only truth. And truth, when it is not forced or filtered, carries a kind of clarity that is deeply felt. So instead of asking, how will they respond if I say this? A different question begins to guide you. Am I willing to stand in what is true for me, regardless of the response? Because the moment you release the need to control the outcome, your expression becomes clean. And that clarity is what makes your presence magnetic. Not because it guarantees connection, but because it reveals who is truly aligned with you. And that is where real connection begins. What if the highest form of magnetism is the ability to remain fully rooted in yourself, even when you are not chosen? There is a moment that defines everything. It doesn't happen when things are going well. It doesn't appear in the ease of mutual attraction or the comfort of being wanted. It reveals itself in the opposite space, in the moment where someone hesitates, pulls away, or simply does not choose you in the way you hoped. And in that moment, something deep within you is activated. Old questions rise. What did I do wrong? What should I change? How do I fix this? And almost automatically, the focus turns outward, toward adjusting, understanding, regaining control. Because being chosen has been unconsciously linked to being safe, valuable, complete. But what if this moment is not a failure? What if it is the most precise invitation you will ever receive? Because in that exact space where you are not chosen by someone else, you are given a rare opportunity to choose yourself, not as a concept, not as a reaction, but as a grounded decision to remain aligned with who you are even when it is not reflected back to you. And this is where magnetism reaches its highest expression, because you are no longer dependent on external confirmation to stabilize your identity. You are no longer negotiating your worth based on who stays or who leaves. You are no longer abandoning yourself to restore connection. You remain present, clear, undivided. And from that place, something extraordinary happens. Rejection loses its meaning. It is no longer interpreted as a statement about your value, but as information about alignment. A redirection, not a diminishment. And this changes everything. Because now, Your energy is no longer shaped by fear of loss, but by trust in your own consistency. You don't chase. You don't collapse. You don't perform. You stand. And that standing, quiet, stable, unapologetic, is what creates a presence that cannot be replaced or ignored. Because the most magnetic person in any room is not the one who is chosen by everyone. It is the one who never stops choosing themselves. So the final question becomes, if no one else chose you in this moment, would you still remain fully with yourself? Because the answer to that question defines everything that follows. If this message shifted something within you, stay connected to this space. Subscribe, like the video, and share it with someone who is ready to remember their power. Your presence here is not a coincidence, it's alignment. What if the relationship that has the power to transform all others is the one you have with the part of you that was never fully seen? There is a version of you that still lives beneath your current identity, not in theory but in sensation, in emotional reactions that seem disproportionate, in moments where something small feels unexpectedly intense, in the quiet longing for reassurance, for safety, for being chosen without effort. This is not weakness. It is memory, not necessarily in words or clear images, but in the body, in the nervous system, in the emotional blueprint that was formed before you had the ability to question it. This is what many refer to as the inner child, not as a concept, but as a living layer of your experience that continues to shape how you relate, how you attach, how you respond when connection feels uncertain. And here is where everything begins to shift. Because as long as this part of you remains unseen, you will unconsciously look for others to meet needs that were never fully acknowledged, to provide safety, validation, consistency, often in ways they are not equipped to sustain. And when they don't, it feels personal. It feels like rejection. But what if the real invitation is not to find someone who can perfectly meet those needs, but to begin meeting them within yourself? Not in isolation, not in avoidance, but in awareness. In learning to recognize when a reaction is not just about the present moment, but about something older being activated. In pausing long enough to feel it, to name it, to stay with it, without immediately projecting it outward. This is where healing becomes real, because you are no longer trying to eliminate the reaction. You are learning to relate to it differently, to respond instead of react, to support instead of suppress. And slowly something changes. That part of you begins to feel less urgent, less reactive, less dependent on external confirmation, not because it disappeared, but because it was finally acknowledged. And from that place, your relationships begin to shift, not because others have changed, but because you are no longer asking them to complete something that is now being held within you. So, the question becomes, what part of you is still waiting to be seen not by someone else, but by you? Because the moment you turn toward it, your entire relational field begins to transform. What if everything you expect from love was shaped long before you ever experienced it consciously? There is a silent architecture beneath every relationship you enter, a set of expectations, emotional reflexes, and unspoken rules that feel so natural, you rarely question them. You may believe you are choosing freely, deciding what you want, what you tolerate, what feels right. But what if those choices were influenced long before you were aware of them? Because your earliest environment did more than teach you how to behave. It taught you how love feels. If love was consistent, safe, and responsive, your system learned that connection is stable, that presence can be trusted, that you can exist without constantly adjusting to maintain closeness. But if love was unpredictable, conditional, distant, or overwhelming, your system adapted in a very different way. It learned to monitor, to anticipate, to earn, to hold on tightly or withdraw quickly, to become hyper-aware of shifts in tone, energy, attention. Not because you chose to, but because it was necessary to stay connected. And over time, that adaptation became your internal map. So when you step into relationships now, you are not just responding to the present moment. You are navigating through that map. This is why certain dynamics feel instantly familiar, why you may feel drawn to what challenges you, or unsettled by what is calm and steady. Because your system is not always seeking what is healthy, it is seeking what it recognizes. And recognition can feel like truth. But here is where awareness begins to change everything. Because the moment you realize that your expectations are not fixed, that they were shaped, learned, and reinforced, you create space for something new. You begin to question what once felt automatic. You begin to see that what feels normal may not actually be aligned. And from that awareness, a different kind of choice becomes possible. Not based on habit, but on consciousness. So the question becomes, what version of love are you still responding to without realizing it? Because the moment you see the map, you are no longer bound to follow it. And that is where a new experience of connection begins. What if the moment you fear being misunderstood is the exact moment you are closest to becoming free? There is a threshold most people hesitate to cross. It appears when you begin to shift, when you start setting boundaries, expressing truth, choosing yourself in ways that feel unfamiliar. And almost immediately something happens. The reactions change. People who once felt comfortable with you may begin to question you. Some may pull away. Others may interpret your clarity as distance, your boundaries as rejection, your silence as indifference. And in that moment, an old fear resurfaces. What if they see me as the problem? So you pause. You soften your stance. You explain more than necessary. You try to make your truth more digestible, more acceptable, less disruptive. But what if that instinct is the very thing keeping you from your next level of alignment? Because when you begin to step out of roles that others have unconsciously assigned to you, the one who always gives, always understands, always accommodates, you are not just changing your behavior. You are changing the agreement. And not everyone is ready for that shift. Some will resist, not because you are wrong, but because your change disrupts the version of you they learned to rely on. The version that made things predictable, comfortable, easy to navigate. So when that version begins to dissolve, they may not celebrate your growth. They may challenge it. And this is where a powerful choice emerges. You can return to the familiar, to being liked, approved, easily understood. Or you can stay rooted in your truth, even when it creates temporary discomfort, even when it shifts how others perceive you. Because being misunderstood is not always a sign that something is wrong. Sometimes, it is a sign that something is finally real, that you are no longer filtering yourself to fit expectations, that you are no longer negotiating your identity for the sake of harmony. And in that space, something liberating happens. You stop needing to control how you are seen. You start allowing yourself to be. So the question becomes, what version of yourself are you protecting by avoiding being misunderstood? Because the moment you release that protection, you step into a kind of freedom that no external approval can give you. What if setting boundaries isn't what pushes people away, but what finally reveals who is truly aligned with you? There is a common fear that lives quietly beneath many decisions. If I say no, if I express this clearly, if I stop allowing what I've been tolerating, I might lose this connection. So instead, you stretch. You make exceptions. You give more time, more energy, more understanding than you genuinely have available. Not because you want to, but because you fear what might happen if you don't. And for a while, it seems to work. The connection continues. The tension stays hidden. The discomfort is postponed. But beneath the surface, something begins to accumulate. Resentment, fatigue, a quiet sense of being misaligned with your own truth. Because every time you override a boundary, you're not just accommodating the other person. You are disconnecting from yourself. And that disconnection is felt. Not always immediately, not always consciously, but over time, it changes the quality of the relationship. Because connection without boundaries is not closeness. It is diffusion. It lacks clarity. It lacks structure. It lacks the very elements that allow two individuals to meet each other as whole, separate, self-respecting beings. So, what happens when you begin to set boundaries? Not aggressively, not defensively, but calmly, clearly, without apology. At first, it may feel uncomfortable. The dynamic shifts. The expectations change. Some people may push back, question you, or even withdraw. And this is where the deeper truth begins to reveal itself. Because boundaries don't create distance where alignment exists. They create clarity where it doesn't. They filter out what cannot meet you where you are. And they strengthen what can. So instead of asking, will this push them away? A more grounded question emerges. What does this boundary reveal about the true nature of this connection? Because when your boundaries are clear, your energy becomes stable. Your presence becomes defined. And the connections that remain are no longer built on what you tolerate. They are built on what you honor. And that is where real respect begins. What if the parts of yourself you've been avoiding are not obstacles, but gateways to the very freedom you've been searching for? There is a dimension within you that most people spend years trying not to encounter. The uncomfortable reactions, the jealousy, the neediness, the anger, the fear of being replaced, overlooked, or not enough. These aspects are often pushed aside, judged, or hidden, not only from others but from yourself. Because somewhere along the way, you learned that these parts were unacceptable. So you separated from them. You created an identity around being composed, kind, understanding, self-sufficient, anything that kept you aligned with being good and worthy of connection. And while that identity may have helped you function, it also created a division, a shadow, not as something dark or negative, but as everything that was excluded from your conscious self. And here is where magnetism quietly dissolves. Because when you reject parts of your own emotional experience, you fragment your energy. You become someone who is only partially available, not only to others, but to yourself. And that internal disconnection subtly influences every interaction. But what happens when that changes? What happens when, instead of suppressing or judging those parts, you begin to turn toward them with curiosity instead of resistance? Something unexpected begins to unfold. Because the shadow is not empty. It holds energy. Raw, unprocessed, powerful energy that has been waiting to be acknowledged. And when you allow yourself to feel what was once avoided, without immediately trying to fix or escape it, that energy begins to move. It integrates. It transforms. And the qualities hidden within it, assertiveness, desire, emotional depth, boundaries, self-protection, start to become accessible again. This is why facing your shadow is not about becoming darker. It is about becoming whole. Because the more of yourself you are willing to include, the less energy you spend managing what you exclude. And that wholeness is what creates a presence that cannot be ignored. So, the question becomes, what part of your emotional world have you been resisting that might actually be holding the key to your liberation? Because what you are willing to face is what you are finally able to free. What if the exhaustion you feel in relationships is not coming from loving too much, but from loving in roles that slowly drain your energy? There are patterns that look like care, responsibility, even devotion, but underneath, they are something else entirely. You may recognize them if you look closely. The impulse to fix what isn't yours. The urge to step in before being asked. The quiet belief that if you just give a little more, understand a little deeper, hold a little longer, things will finally stabilize. And for a while, it can feel meaningful. You feel needed, important, connected. But over time, something begins to shift. The giving becomes expected. The effort becomes invisible. The connection starts to feel one-sided, heavy, unsustainable. And instead of feeling closer, you feel depleted. This is the hidden dynamic of codependent roles. Not as a flaw, but as a pattern. A pattern where your sense of worth becomes entangled with how much you can support, carry, or hold for others. Where love becomes something you prove through effort, rather than something you receive through alignment. And within this pattern, 3 roles often emerge. The one who saves, the one who sacrifices, the one who tries to control outcomes to prevent discomfort. Each one feels different on the surface, but they share the same core. They keep your attention outward, focused on managing, adjusting, and maintaining the relationship, while slowly disconnecting you from your own needs, limits, and truth. And this is where your energy begins to fragment again, because you are present, but not fully with yourself. You are giving, but not from a place of overflow. You are connecting, but not from alignment. So the question becomes unavoidable. What would remain of this connection if you stop trying to hold it together? Because the moment you step out of these roles, something is revealed. Either the connection rebalances, or it cannot sustain itself. And in that revelation, something deeper emerges. Not loss, but clarity. And from that clarity, a new kind of connection becomes possible, one that does not require you to disappear in order to exist. What if the foundation of true magnetism is not confidence, but self-acceptance, so complete that nothing within you needs to be hidden anymore? Most people spend years trying to become more confident, believing that confidence is what makes them attractive, respected, and desired. They work on how they speak, how they move, how they present themselves. And while those things can enhance expression, they do not create the core of magnetism, because confidence without acceptance is fragile. It depends on outcomes, on reactions, on being received in a certain way. And the moment that external validation shifts, confidence begins to fluctuate. But self-acceptance is different. It is not built on performance. It is built on permission. Permission to exist as you are without constant self-correction. Permission to feel what you feel without immediately trying to regulate it for others. Permission to express what is true, even if it is not perfectly received. And when that permission becomes internal, something stabilizes. You are no longer scanning every interaction for approval. You are no longer adjusting your energy to maintain a certain image. You are no longer filtering yourself through the question, will this make me more acceptable? Instead, a quieter, more grounded state emerges. I am already acceptable, and from that place, I choose how I show up. This is what creates presence. Because presence is not about being impressive. It is about being undivided. When you stop rejecting parts of yourself, your intensity, your sensitivity, your desires, your boundaries, you stop fragmenting your energy. And that wholeness becomes tangible. People feel it as calmness, as certainty, as depth. Not because you're trying to project something, but because there is nothing within you that is trying to hide. And that is what makes someone unforgettable. Not perfection, but the rare, almost magnetic experience of being in the presence of someone who is fully at ease with who they are. So the question shifts once again. What parts of you are still waiting for permission to exist? Because the moment you give it, your entire energy changes. What if the parts of you you've been trying to hide are the very parts that would create the deepest connection if you allowed them to be seen? It sounds counterintuitive at first, because for most of your life, you were taught, directly or indirectly, that certain aspects of you were too much, not appropriate, or simply inconvenient for others. Maybe it was your intensity, your sensitivity, your ambition, your need for space, your desire to speak honestly, your emotional depth. So you learned to manage them, to soften your reactions, to dilute your expression, to present a version of yourself that would be easier to accept. And it worked to a point. You were included, accepted, maybe even valued. But something essential was missing, because connection built on partial truth can never feel complete. There is always a quiet distance, a subtle gap between who you are and what is being received. And no matter how close someone seems, part of you remains untouched, unrecognized. This is the hidden cost of hiding your light. Not because your light is inherently overwhelming, but because it carries information. It carries truth. It reveals who you are beyond roles and adaptations. And when that information is withheld, the connection becomes limited to what is shown, not what is real. But here is where everything begins to shift. The moment you start allowing those parts of you to exist openly, not forcefully, not dramatically, but honestly, something changes in the field between you and others. Some people may step back. Some may not understand, but others will feel something different. Relief, recognition, resonance. Because authenticity is not just attractive, it is liberating to witness. It gives others permission to drop their own masks. And suddenly, connection is no longer about maintaining an image. It becomes about meeting. So the real question is not, will I be accepted if I show this part of me? It is, what kind of connection am I limiting by continuing to hide it? Because the depth you seek can only exist at the level of truth you are willing to reveal. Why do the same emotional experiences keep returning, even when you are certain you've moved on? At first, it feels confusing. You change the environment. You meet new people. You tell yourself this time will be different. And yet, somehow, the same feelings resurface. Uncertainty, overthinking, emotional imbalance, the quiet sense of losing yourself in the process. It can feel like life is repeating itself. But what if it's not repetition and something closer to revelation? Because what returns is rarely the situation itself. It is the state within you that has not yet been fully seen, understood, or integrated. The outer world simply becomes the stage where that internal state can be experienced again until it is no longer unconscious. This is one of the most overlooked principles of co-creation. Reality does not just respond to what you want. It reflects what is still active within you. And what is active seeks expression. So if there is a belief beneath the surface that says, I have to earn love, or I am not fully chosen, or I must adapt to be accepted, life will continue to present situations that mirror that belief. Not to confirm it as truth, but to make it visible. But visibility alone is not enough. Because most people, when faced with the same emotional pattern, focus on changing the external variables. They analyze the other person. They adjust their behavior. They try to control the outcome. And in doing so, they miss the deeper invitation to turn inward, to recognize that the repetition is not happening to you. it is happening through you. And the moment that realization lands, something shifts. Because now, instead of asking, how do I stop this from happening again? A more transformative question arises. What part of me is still generating this experience? And what would it mean to finally meet it differently? Because the cycle does not break when the world changes. It breaks when your relationship to yourself does. And that is where the pattern begins to lose its power. What if the real turning point in your life begins the moment you stop abandoning yourself to keep others close? There is a subtle habit that most people never question because it feels normal, almost invisible. It shows up in the small decisions, the moments where you say yes when you mean no, where you stay silent when something doesn't feel right, where you adjust your truth just enough to avoid tension, rejection, or disconnection. And at first, it seems harmless, even kind, even loving. But beneath it, there is a quiet cost. Because every time you override your own needs, dismiss your own feelings, or compromise your own boundaries to maintain connection, you are sending a powerful signal to yourself. My presence is less important than preserving this relationship. And your system listens. It begins to internalize that your voice is negotiable, that your limits are flexible, that your truth can be postponed. And over time, something inside you starts to fade, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually. Your clarity softens. Your energy disperses. Your sense of self becomes harder to locate. And this is where magnetism begins to collapse. Not because you are lacking something, but because you are consistently stepping away from yourself in the moments that matter most. But here is where the shift becomes real. The moment you begin to notice this pattern, without judgment, without self-criticism, you open a new possibility. Because awareness interrupts automation. And now, instead of automatically adjusting yourself, you have a choice. To pause, to feel, to ask a different question. What would it look like to stay with myself right now, even if it creates discomfort? This is not about becoming rigid or closed. It is not about pushing others away or proving a point. It is about restoring a fundamental alignment where your actions begin to reflect your inner truth. And something remarkable happens when you do. Your energy stabilizes. Your presence becomes clearer. Your boundaries no longer feel like defenses. They feel like integrity. And whether others like it or not, they begin to feel it. Because for the first time, you are no longer negotiating your worth in exchange for connection. You are choosing yourself within it. And that is where your power returns. What if the subtle discomfort others feel around you is not about what you're doing wrong, but about what you're not fully allowing yourself to be? There is a kind of tension that cannot be explained with logic. You can say the right things, behave with kindness, offer attention, support, presence, and still, something doesn't quite land. Conversations feel slightly strained. Connections feel a little distant. And no matter how much you give, the depth you're seeking seems just out of reach. Why? Because human beings do not connect only through words or actions. They connect through congruence, through the alignment between what is expressed and what is actually felt. And when that alignment is missing, even subtly, it creates a quiet distortion. When you smile while suppressing discomfort, when you agree while internally resisting, when you present confidence while doubting your own worth, your nervous system sends mixed signals. Not consciously, not intentionally, but energetically. And others pick up on it, even if they cannot name it. This is what weakens your presence. Not lack of effort, not lack of value, but the gap between your external expression and your internal truth. Because every time you hide a feeling, silence a need, or adjust yourself to maintain harmony, you are fragmenting your own energy. Part of you, is showing up. Another part is pulling back. And that internal division becomes perceptible. This is why authenticity is not just a philosophical idea, it is a physiological state. When your thoughts, emotions, and expressions begin to align, your system stabilizes. Your presence becomes clearer. Your energy stops leaking. And suddenly, connection feels different. Not because you are doing more, but because you are dividing less. So the question is no longer, how do I become more attractive? It becomes, where am I still splitting myself in order to be accepted? Because every place where you return to yourself restores a part of your magnetism, and that restoration is felt long before it is understood. What if the fear of being fully seen isn't a personality trait, but a memory your body is still protecting you from? There are moments when you feel the impulse to speak, to express, to show more of who you are, and yet something stops you. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly. A hesitation, a tightening in your chest, a subtle voice that says, "Not here, not now, this might not be safe." And most people interpret that as insecurity. But what if it's something deeper? Your nervous system is not wired to prioritize authenticity. It is wired to prioritize safety. And if, at any point in your past, being fully expressed led to rejection, criticism, disconnection, or emotional withdrawal, your system learned something very specific. Visibility can cost connection. So it adapted. It learned to filter your expression, to soften your truth, to monitor reactions, to anticipate disapproval before it even arrives. Not because you are weak, but because you are intelligent. Because your system found a way to protect what mattered most at the time. But here is where the distortion begins. That protection does not disappear when the environment changes. It stays active long after the original threat is gone. So even in safe situations, with people who might actually welcome your authenticity, your body still reacts as if something is at risk. And this is where magnetism gets interrupted. Because the parts of you that carry the most life, the most depth, the most presence are often the same parts you learn to regulate, reduce, or hide. Not because they were wrong, but because they were once inconvenient for connection. So now, every time you feel that hesitation, the pause before you speak, the urge to adjust yourself, you are not just experiencing fear. You are encountering a pattern that says, stay within what is acceptable and you will remain connected. But what if the very thing you've been protecting yourself from is the doorway to the kind of connection you've been seeking all along? And what if the next step is not forcing yourself to be different, but slowly teaching your system that it is finally safe to be seen? Why does something feel so familiar, even when it hurts? Have you ever met someone and felt an instant pull, an intensity that seemed almost destined, only to realize later that the connection carried the same emotional patterns you thought you had already outgrown? The same confusion, the same overgiving, the same subtle sense of losing yourself just to keep the connection alive. Why does that happen? Because attraction is not always guided by what is healthy. More often, it is guided by what is familiar. Your nervous system does not choose based on logic. It chooses based on recognition. It scans for emotional environments that resemble what it has known before, especially those formed in your earliest relationships. Not because they were ideal, but because they became the blueprint of what connection feels like. And here is where the deeper layer of co-creation begins to reveal itself. What you call chemistry is often the activation of an old pattern seeking resolution. It is the subconscious saying, this feels like something unfinished, maybe this time we can complete it. So you are drawn in, not by randomness, but by repetition with a purpose. This is why different faces can evoke the same emotional experience. The details change, the personality, the context, the story, but the core dynamic remains. One person pulls away, another overextends. One avoids, the other chases. And somewhere in between, the same internal wound is being touched again. Not to punish you, not to trap you, but to reveal something that has been operating beneath awareness. Because until that pattern is seen clearly, you will not recognize it as a pattern. You will experience it as reality. And that changes everything. Because the moment you begin to ask, what is this connection activating in me? Instead of, why are they acting this way? You step out of unconscious repetition and into conscious awareness. And from that place, something new becomes possible, something that has nothing to do with chasing, fixing, or holding on. It has everything to do with seeing. And what you are about to see will change the way you interpret attraction forever. What if the version of you that people learn to love was never fully you? Somewhere in your early life, often without realizing it, you began to understand something subtle but powerful. Love was not just given, it was negotiated. Maybe it came more easily when you were quiet, helpful, easy to manage. Maybe it arrived when you performed well, solved problems, stayed strong, or avoided being too much. And slowly, almost invisibly, a role was formed. Not as a conscious decision, but as an emotional strategy. You learned who to be in order to stay connected. For some, that role became the one who gives endlessly, the caretaker, the one who anticipates needs before they are spoken. For others, it became the one who achieves, proves, impresses, and earns admiration through excellence. And for many, it became the one who never creates friction, who suppresses discomfort, avoids conflict, and keeps the peace at any cost. And over time, something profound happens. The role stops feeling like a role and starts feeling like identity. But here is the quiet truth that changes everything. That version of you was not created from your essence. It was created from adaptation, from the intelligent, instinctive need to maintain love, safety, and belonging in an environment where certain parts of you may not have felt welcome. And while that adaptation may have protected you then, it begins to cost you now. Because every time you enter a connection from that role, you are not bringing your full presence. You are bringing a curated version of yourself designed to be accepted. And even if the relationship continues, something inside you remains unseen, unchosen. This is why some connections feel exhausting even when nothing is wrong. Because you are being loved but not fully known. And deep down, your system recognizes the difference. So the question begins to shift again, not why don't they see me, but where am I still hiding the parts of me that were never allowed to be seen? Because the moment you start to see that role for what it is, you also begin to loosen your attachment to it. And that is where your real energy starts to return. What if the reason some people seem unforgettable has nothing to do with beauty, status, or technique, but with an invisible frequency they've stopped betraying within themselves? There is a kind of presence that cannot be faked for long. You can imitate confidence. You can rehearse charm. You can learn the right words, the right posture, the right timing. And still, something feels off. People may smile, respond, even stay close for a while, but deep down they do not feel the full force of your presence.
Why?
Because magnetism is not created at the surface of personality. It is generated in the hidden space where energy, identity, and self-perception begin to agree with one another. Most people spend years trying to become more attractive by adjusting what can be seen. They refine their image, soften their voice, become more agreeable, more useful, more emotionally available, more impressive. But the more they perform for connection, the more disconnected they become from the very force that makes connection real. This is the paradox almost no one sees at first. The harder you try to be chosen from the outside, the more you abandon the inner state that makes you naturally compelling. Because true magnetism does not begin when others notice you. It begins when you stop leaving yourself. And that is where everything starts to change. The moment you stop asking, "What do I need to do so they will want me?" a deeper question begins to rise from underneath it. What part of me have I been taught to hide in order to feel safe, loved, or accepted? That question changes the entire field. Suddenly, magnetism is no longer about seduction. It becomes about coherence, about wholeness, about the return of energy that has been scattered across roles, masks, and survival patterns. This is why some people walk into a room and say very little, yet their presence is felt immediately. It is not because they are trying harder. It is because they are divided less. Their energy is not leaking through self-rejection, performance, or fear. And whether the world can explain it or not, everyone can feel the difference. So before we speak about attraction, relationships, and the mysterious force that draws people in, we have to begin here, with a quiet but radical shift that makes all of it possible. What if the person you become magnetic to first must be yourself? If the world is constantly responding to you, even when you are not aware of it, what exactly is it responding to? Most people believe they're being seen for what they do, what they say, or how they present themselves. But the deeper truth is far more subtle and far more powerful. You are not being responded to at the level of performance. You are being responded to at the level of agreement. The world reflects the way you relate to yourself long before it reacts to anything you show on the outside. Have you ever noticed how two people can say the exact same words, yet one feels grounded and compelling, while the other feels uncertain or draining? The difference is not in the message. It is in the internal state behind it. One is speaking from self-alignment. The other is speaking while silently negotiating their own worth. This is where the real mechanism of magnetism begins to reveal itself. Because every interaction you have carries an invisible signal. This is how I see myself. This is how I allow myself to be treated. This is what I believe I deserve. And whether people consciously recognize it or not, they respond to that signal with precision. When you abandon yourself to maintain connection, the world learns that your presence is negotiable. When you suppress your truth to avoid discomfort, the world learns that your voice is optional. And when you constantly adjust who you are to be accepted, the world reflects that instability back to you through inconsistent attention, unclear intentions, and connections that never fully land. But what happens when that pattern is interrupted? What happens when, instead of asking, "How do I make this work?" you begin to ask, "Where am I not choosing myself right now?" This is where the shift becomes tangible, because the moment you begin to stand in quiet self-approval, not arrogance, not force, but grounded acceptance, something recalibrates. Your energy stops asking for permission. Your presence becomes less about proving and more about existing. And people feel it, even if they cannot explain it. So the question is no longer whether others will choose you. The real question is, what are you teaching the world about how to choose you, by the way you choose yourself? If this is resonating with you, take a moment to subscribe and like the video. It helps this message reach the people who are ready to hear it.